this is January part 2. Why is it not easy to read Shakespeare? What happens to Mrs. Baker's face? Why was the bus driving around? What was Mrs. Biggio carrying? What did Holling realize? Right, so the next afternoon, after everyone had left for Temple Beth El or St. Adalbert's, and after Doug Switek and Danny had waited around until the very last minute in case Mrs. Baker had arranged for Whitey Ford to show up, Mrs. Baker handed me back my Macbeth test. Macbeth and Malcolm are not the same person, though their names share an initial consonant, she said. I know, I said. Nor are Duncan and Donalbain, who also share an initial, and for that matter, concluding consonant, the same person. Well, I guess not, I said. Malcolm and Donalbain are the king's sons, not... You know, I said, it's not so easy to read Shakespeare, especially when he can't come up with names that you can tell apart. That's number 1. Mrs. Baker rolled her eyes. This time I was sure. Shakespeare did not write for your ease of reading, she said. No kidding, I thought. He wrote to express something about what it means to be a human being in words more beautiful than ever yet been written. So in Macbeth, when he wasn't trying to find names that sound alike, what was he wanting to express in words more beautiful than had ever yet been written? Mrs. Baker looked at me a long moment, and she went and sat down at her desk. That we are made for more than power, she said softly. That we are made for more than our desires. That pride combined with stubbornness can be a disaster. And that compared with love, malice is a small and petty thing. We were both quiet. Malice is not always small and petty, I said. Have you seen what Doug Switek's brother put up in the halls? I have, said Mrs. Baker. A wonderful picture of you playing a wonderful part. In yellow tights, I said. Well, she said, you may chance have some odd quirks and remnants of wit broken on you. That doesn't sound like it's from Macbeth. It's not. But I promise you, people will soon forget about Ariel. I sighed. It's a whole lot easier saying that than seeing yourself in that picture. I suppose that would be true, she said. It's not like it's your picture in the halls, or that you have all that much to worry about, I said. I know. Dumb. Mrs. Baker's face went suddenly, completely white. That's number 2. She opened her lower desk drawer, put her copy of Shakespeare into it, and closed it, loudly. Go sit down and fix the errors on your Macbeth exam, she said. I did. We said nothing else to each other that whole afternoon, not even when I left. I walked home under gray clouds whose undersides had been shredded. They hung in tatters, and a cold mist leaked out of them. The colder got colder, and the mist got mistier all through the afternoon, so that by the supper time, a drizzle was making everything wet and everyone miserable, especially my sister, who believed that she had hair that belonged in Southern California, where it could be springy and bouncy all the time, instead of in a gray, cold, misty Long Island, where it just hung. So dumb. Lying in bed that night, I listened as the drizzle turned to a rain, and then the rain started to spatter thickly on the window, and then all sounds of it faded away and my room began to grow cold. I got up and looked out, but the glass was covered with a sheet of thin ice, and the only thing I could see was a crazy pattern on the streetlight outside. In the morning, ice covered the town. If the sun had been shining, it would have been a spectacle, like something Prospero might conjure up. But as it was, the tattered gray clouds hung even lower, and the mist was leaking out of them again, and the town looked more like the kind of foul heath where Macbeth's 3 weird sisters lived. As I walked to school that morning, the mist laid down a fine, light coating of water on last night's ice, and by the time I got to the library, I could stand on the sidewalk, give a little push, and slide. By the time I got to Goldman's Best Bakery, I didn't even need to push. The last block and a half was all downhill. So I pointed my feet, leaned down a bit, bent my knees, and let myself go. Since there wasn't a single car anywhere, I didn't even have to stop at the corners. By the time I reached Camillo Junior High, I had enough speed to take out Doug Switek's brother, if he'd been anywhere in sight. And then, suddenly, there he was, just like the 3 weird sisters appearing because Macbeth had thought of them. Doug Switek's brother on the other side of Camillo Junior High, waiting for a school bus to turn the corner so he could grab onto its bumper and have it pull him along the icy roads. That's what grade 8s do, whose career goal is the state penitentiary. The school buses were driving around town, even though no cars were, because Mr. Guareschi was principal of Camillo Junior High, and Mr. Guareschi would never let the school close. So that is number 3. Especially before the New York State standardized achievement tests. Even if the Soviet Union had started raining atomic bombs on the entire east coast of the United States, I heard that from Mr. Petrelli himself, and it's probably true. So the buses were driving on ice, and they all pulled in late. And you only had to look at the drivers' faces to see they were all mad at Mr. Guareschi. And Mrs. Baker was mad because we straggled in throughout the morning because the buses were late. I figured that the only one who was happy in the whole school was Mr. Ludema, Doug Switek's brother's teacher, because Doug Switek's brother stayed out until the last bus came in. "It's that dictator of a small country thing," Danny said when he finally got to class. He was on the last bus. "Mr. Guareschi thinks he can control the weather. He tells us to come to school in the ice and we come. He tells the bus drivers to drive in the ice and they drive. He controls all the school buses of the world." He held his hands up in the air. "He controls us all." Danny Huffer can get carried away sometimes. But even if Mr. Guareschi could control the school buses like the dictator of a small country, he couldn't control the Long Island Power Company, which that morning was spending its time not giving electricity to most of its customers, including Camillo Junior High. You couldn't have raised a spark of electricity anywhere, any light that came into the classrooms from the window, and on a day of gray, tattered clouds, that wasn't much. So we sat in the half-dark, in our coats, in the cold. We could hear Sycorax and Caliban scurrying in the walls, climbing down from the ceiling to find someplace warm to burrow in. Like a human body, maybe. I figured they could probably sense us, and soon the walls would start to shred, and then we'd see claws and nails, and there would be clacking yellow teeth. And before Burnham Wood could come to Dunesane, we'd all be screaming out of the room into the misty cold. So we'll continue January Part 2 in the next video.